Now, it's a horrible feeling when you're hyped to play a video game only to learn that it doesn't live up to expectations, and sometimes you can exactly pinpoint those moments. And that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 exact moments you realized that games had wasted your money. Number 10. Samus's characterization. Metroid Other M. Metroid has put a heavy focus on exploration, atmosphere, and power-ups ever since it debuted. However, the spacefaring platformer rarely places the spotlight on character development. Samus Aran has been the face of the series since day one, despite the fact that she never speaks and rarely interacts with anyone. But that all changed with Metroid Other M. Team Ninja's cosmic adventure title promised to explore Samus's backstory and show her working with a team, which seemed like a pretty neat way to flesh out the galactic bounty hunter. Unfortunately, this idea fell flat the instant that Samus spoke. Her portrayal is so lifeless. Samus was actually way more compelling when she didn't talk, which sounds horrible to say. Despite being a noble warrior who's defeated gargantuan monsters, Samus is depicted as whiny, immature, and petulant from the opening scene. It's also disrespectful to depict her obeying unreasonable orders from her male superior, considering she's a feminine icon, and has saved the world numerous times by this point. Samus's personality is so disconnected to how she's been portrayed before and since. The Other M would have actually been better if her dialogue was removed completely. This Metroid installment has plenty of other issues, like the stupid mother brain twist, but the way the developers mishandled the badass heroine they have on their hands, well, that's top of the list. Number 9. The non-existent AI. Star Wars Outlaws. Star Wars Outlaws seemed like a nice change of pace on the surface, since it actually didn't revolve around the Jedi fighting the Sith for the zillionth time. Instead, you take control of a blaster-wielding scoundrel named Kay, who must assemble a plucky team of criminals to pull off a life-changing heist. Kay isn't armed with a lightsaber or the Force, so she needs to be more careful in combat than previous Star Wars titles. Well, at least in theory. Unfortunately, the enemy AI is laughably broken here, with stormtroopers unable to find Kay even when they're right beside her. The Empire's troops are canonically bad at shooting. We will accept this, but it's still pretty ridiculous when the enemies can't hit you when you're standing out in an open space, even on the hardest difficulty. Although badly programmed AI is an issue with any game, it's extremely noticeable here, since there's such a focus on sneaking around and evading enemies. Considering Outlaws was overseen by Ubisoft, the stealth mechanics should be on par with Assassin's Creed. Instead, players will be getting flashbacks of aliens, colonial marines, dead AI when facing off against these Imperial forces. Number 8. The unsatisfying combat. Paper Mario Origami King. Even though Paper Mario is beloved, there is no doubt the series peaked with the second installment, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door. After a string of pretty lackluster follow-ups, the fanbase was praying that Paper Mario Origami King would revitalize the flat, pun intended, adventure saga. To be fair, the Switch exclusive has many creative ideas involving bending and contouring paper to solve puzzles and open new areas. Also, riding around in a boot is surprisingly addictive. However, Origami King made two fundamental flubs, both of which are evident during the first fight. Firstly, there's no level up system whatsoever. In principle, role players should get boring pretty quickly since the bulk of gameplay revolves around having hundreds of enemy encounters. This is why it's vital to reward heroes with experience points upon every battle, since they'll feel like they're constantly making progress. But since this system was pointlessly removed from Origami King, players will just try to get from point A to B as soon as they can, because there's no rewards for doing anything else. Sadly though, there's a bigger problem. Though Super Mario is renowned for his accessibility, the combat here is bafflingly convoluted. Rather than fighting in a straightforward bout, enemy encounters take place in a concentric battlefield. Each inner circle must be rotated to line up the enemies to maximize combos. As a result, you'll need to be fully switched on in every battle, since a single mistake can result in Mario's defeat. Also, understanding this mechanic doesn't come naturally to some players. If you're one of those sorry few, well, playing Origami King is an utter nightmare. Number 7. The vehicles. Banjo-Kazooie, nuts and bolts. After Rare was acquired by Microsoft, there were concerns what would happen to the IPs their company made under Nintendo. Although Banjo-Kazooie was one of Rare's heavy hitters, there was little word about a follow-up after the Microsoft purchase. For this reason, it looked like the adorable platformer could become a relic of the past. So, when Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was announced, things seemed promising, and based on how the threequel opens, it definitely looks like another solid adventure for the lovable bird and bear. But about 10 minutes in, the titular pair are informed that they must ride a vehicle vehicle to reach their next destination, which at first doesn't sound like a big deal, but after entering the first level, it's made unmistakably clear that driving and constructing vehicles plays an integral role in the gameplay. Banjo-Kazooie has always been a platformer first and foremost, so it seemed forced to incorporate this left-field mechanic. Now, that's not suggesting a platformer centered around building and driving automobiles is a bad idea. It worked completely fine in Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, but it becomes a problem when the vehicle sections aren't fun. Not only is the vehicle editor tedious and needlessly complex, every car, plane, and boat is difficult to control. Even though Nuts and Bolts had potential, throwing in this jarring mechanic, well, it caused the franchise to crash and burn. Number 6. Right before the first match starts, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. When booting up a Marvel vs. game for the first time, players should be giddy to see which iconic heroes and villains are on the roster. However, there was something obviously wrong with Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite the instant the character select mode appeared. And that's due to a legal dispute between 20th Century Fox and Marvel Studios. None of the X-Men were included. This was a huge shame since the beloved mutants were among the best fighters, especially Wolverine, who had appeared in every entry up until this point. Not only did the roster recycle most of the participants from the previous entry, many of the new candidates weren't particularly compelling. Instead of the likes of Magneto, players had to settle for Frank West, Nova, and Firebrand. I mean, who's clamoring to play as Firebrand? Rather than building upon the mechanics of its predecessor, Infinite went backwards. Although the last 2 installments allowed you to select 3 fighters, you could only fight as a pair this time around, making the joint combos and special moves far less intricate and dynamic. Even though Infinite was criticized for its weak story, simplified super attacks, and poor graphics, players knew they were in for a bad time before the first match even began. Number 5. The broken loot system, Anthem. Now, criticizing Anthem at this point in time is like shooting fish in a barrel with a BFG 9000. However, it has so many obvious flaws, it's hard to pinpoint which is the most glaring. Is it the lack of content, the generic mission structure? Is it the forgettable characters? Or is it the fact the creators didn't learn a thing after fumbling the original Destiny? These are all relevant points, but BioWare's shoddy sci-fi shooter's biggest screw-up is its loot system. After Star Wars Battlefront 2 was universally panned for its imbalanced loot crates, you'd think that gaming companies would be extra careful when implementing this business model into their projects. But just like in Battlefront 2, the drop rate of Anthem's loot crates is atrocious, to the point where you could play for hours on end without receiving anything worthwhile. Unfortunately, this creates another problem. If players don't bother with the loot, they'll have to grind like crazy to make any progress, which seems like a lazy way to inflate playtime. Considering the loot system was meant to be the bedrock of Anthem, it's bewildering how the developers couldn't figure out a more reasonable way to structure things. Number 4. The Hallway, Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy has always been recognized for its turn-based battles, epic bosses, beautiful soundtracks, sprawling narratives, complex characterization, and of course, the beloved chocobos. But above all else, Square's biggest brand stands out for its non-linear gameplay. Though the heroes have set destinations, they're given a lot of freedom where to go and what to do. Players are encouraged to explore since it leads to new areas, rewards, weapons, and spells. And on top of all of that, it keeps gameplay diversified. After all, it would be tedious to walk on a designated path for hours on end. Right? Looking at you, Final Fantasy XIII, right? Yeah, this game. I hate the fact that people... There's a script in front of me and I'm just going off it right now. I hate the fact that people still come up to this day and say, oh, don't worry, it gets really good about 30 hours in when it opens up to the Great Plain. Does it bollocks, mate? I shouldn't have to play something for 30 hours or so to get into something for it to get good. That's ridiculous. Listen to yourself, man. You've lost the plot. And also, even when it does open up, all you're really doing is giving me a slightly larger area and not having to walk from A to B. It doesn't make it great just because I can do something that I've taken for granted in every other Final Fantasy game. Like I said, there was a script, but that's it. That's what you're getting. Number 3, the loading screen, Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Oh, don't make me bloody start going off the script again with this one here, but okay. Since Sonic the Hedgehog was a titan in the gaming business in the early 90s, second only to Super Mario, things were looking pretty up for him, but during the millennium, it was apparent the popularity of Sega's mascot was on the decline. In 2006, Sega released a Sonic reboot, hoping that it would be a return to form for the once unstoppable IP. Instead, Sonic 06 was branded as the worst entry in the franchise. Players knew the project was doomed, even before they experienced the excessive bugs, atrocious controls, sporadic camera, and the unintentionally hilarious voice acting, because they realized that Sega dropped the ball the instant they saw the diabolical loading screen. The words, "now loading," appear every time Sonic enters a new area, which completely ruins the immersion. And it takes so long for each area to load up, you'll be looking at the painfully long loading screen more often than collecting rings or performing loop-a-de-loops. But that's not all. The screen loads every time that Sonic speaks to an NPC. PC. Worse still, this happens twice since it loads before and after speaking to them. Atrocious. Number 2. Phrase writing. Forspoken. There are a few rules in gaming that are absolute. However, one decree that must be followed is the protagonist should be likable. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to be a nice person. I mean, the leads in Grand Theft Auto, Mafia, and Saints Row, they lack a moral compass, but they still remain popular because they're entertaining and charming. The same cannot be said about Frey from Forspoken. Even though Luminous Productions' fantasy title suffers from derivative combat and barren landscapes, these grumblings pale in comparison to how obnoxious the lead character comes across. The snarky teen becomes a meme factory for cringe due to her awkward dialogue and sarcastic delivery. The fact that players have to stick with her from beginning to end is exhausting, since you can't escape Frey's off-putting quips unless you play things on mute. Although Forspoken has an intriguing narrative, it's not compelling when viewed from a character that is riddled with immaturity and forced teenage angst. And being the devil's advocate, portraying Frey this way could work if she grew into her new role as a hero, but even after developing her eldritch powers and saving the world from evil, Frey remains unbearable. And number 1, realizing this isn't Metal Gear. Metal Gear Survive. Now, Metal Gear Survive was met with a lot of pre-release skepticism, since it was the first entry to launch after the departure of the franchise's creator, Hideo Kojima. Having said that, it's only fair to judge the survivalist spin-off on its own merits. Too bad it doesn't have any. Survive did everything possible to piss off consumers, including relying on an internet connection, utilizing micropayments, recycling assets from Metal Gear Solid 5, and putting a big push on its broken multiplayer. But Survive's greatest sin is the fact that it doesn't capture the soul of Kojima's creation. The espionage saga often involves our hero taking part in secret missions and tracking down nuclear weapons, but within the first few minutes of Survive, the protagonist is sucked into a wormhole and transported into a world populated by zombies which resemble human rhino hybrids. I mean, what about this sentence sounds like Metal Gear? Except for the word rhino, maybe it's a code name. But it's not just the aesthetic or narrative that's out of place, but the gameplay as well. Instead of emphasizing stealth and strategic combat, this clunker focuses on tower defense and crafting mechanics. If it wasn't for the classic sound effects, players will probably forget that they were playing a Metal Gear game. Despite the initial cynicism, there were actual Metal Gear purists who wanted to give Survive the benefit of the doubt, but within a matter of minutes, they surely will have come to realize that it was way worse than they could have ever imagined. And there we go, my friends. Those were the 10 exact moments you realized that games had wasted your money. I hope that you enjoyed that, and let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section below, and go give me a follow over on Blue Sky, where I'm at RetroJ, but the O is a 0. Hope to see you over there. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that, my friends. And I'll speak to you soon. Bye.